The most underrated reason stopping men and women from losing their belly fat. I'll tell you exactly what it is and what it's not. Not a calorie deficit, resistance training, cardio, all the things that you've heard already. This one reason is stopping men and women consistently, and that is cortisol. Today, myself and Dr. Sierra, both medical doctors, both competitive bodybuilders, will give you 5 proven ways to decrease your cortisol and for you to easily unlock your fat and release it for good. This is the one thing that no one is talking about online. We're going to give you the reasons why that's happening and 5 ways and 5 golden rules to lose your belly fat for good.
I was able to completely reverse all of my symptoms. I went from, being confused and having random internal bleeding, nerve pain everywhere, low energy, to having none of that. Cortisol was meant to be evolutionarily helpful. 74% of American adults are overweight or obese. And part of this is because of this chronic stress response that's raising blood sugar. And so their body isn't able to utilize fuel properly. And when it comes to how we look, you'll hear a lot of people talk about cortisol face and cortisol belly. And so it's this choice. Do we choose the pain now or the future pain, right? And what are we deciding to make a decision on?
You either have the pain of regret or you have the pain of discipline.
But what happens if we're on these screens late at night, the phones, the TVs before bed, the extra work that we have to get done? Then we're stimulating this cortisol production. And the primary reasons that we're seeing this is
We have the beautiful Dr. Sierra Baines with us today. What a pleasure, Doc. I just want to jump straight into it. I think you're one of the leading experts in female hormones and their ability to just have control over their body when it comes to fat loss, to also just living a good quality life. But before we dive into that, I wanted to ask a little bit about you. If you could tell my audience a bit about your story, like how did we get to this point, and more so starting back from your genesis?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I am Dr. Sierra Baines. I practice functional medicine, but my story goes back from honestly childhood. I feel like I was always the student that got the good grades. I had multiple jobs. I was really proud of the grind. When somebody asked me how I was doing, I'd say busy, right? Instead of being like, oh, I'm good. No, I'm busy. I loved it. I wore this like busy badge of honor. And in college, I hardly slept. I was getting to my jobs and the gym and social events. And that's where my symptoms really started to show up. I had no sex drive. I had some crazy digestion issues. I was relying on caffeine and energy drinks to motivate me through these long days. And I was honestly running on fumes. And in 2021, I had a reaction to the COVID vaccine. I was working in hospitals at the time, and I had suddenly begun to experience nerve pain and bleeding and really intense fatigue. And after a few hospital visits, I was given 2 autoimmune diagnoses. The first was Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, which is downregulation of the thyroid. And the second was MS, multiple sclerosis, which is a progressive brain disease. And so I went into the holistic route. I started learning about functional medicine, ended up starting my own practice in it. And in that time, I was able to completely reverse all of my symptoms. I went from, being confused and having random internal bleeding, nerve pain everywhere, low energy, to having none of that. I ended up competing in bodybuilding shows, just like you, not to quite the extent of you, but I was able to go on with these athletic adventures that nobody said I would be able to do. And I've healed quite a bit, and there was a lot to learn when it came to regulating my nervous system and my hormones and what had happened not just in 2021, but the years leading up to it.
Incredible. And the way I found you was very much, I resonated with your mode of doing things, is because it was very much related to you. I think what's incredible as well about your story is that you're a medical doctor. So it's not like, hey, all these things just happened out of nowhere. You're well aware of the body and yours specifically, and you decided to take a different route to cure all the issues you're dealing with. Doc, I wanted to ask you, with everything that has happened to you, from the bodybuilding to the MS, what do you feel was the biggest thing that was impacting you on a day-to-day basis, as far as your symptoms, as far as your ability to have your body function the way that you want to, with everything you're feeling?
I believe it really was coming from my state of being. I was operating in this fight or flight energetic where I constantly was under stress, whether it was stress of work or school, or really just this perceived stress that I often made up in my head, and constantly feeling I had to be doing something and running on fumes. That's activating a hormone axis that we'll talk about. It's constantly telling our body that we're in survival mode. And when we're doing that for years or decades, the body just starts to yell at us a little bit, turns on the check engine light where it's like, hey, something's going on under the hood. You really need to pay attention to this. And that's what happened to me in 2021, is like that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me, that injury, right? It wasn't just the only thing that contributed to my symptoms. It was the last thing that my body could tolerate before it told me to sit down.
And that stress, where we're going here and we're talking about cortisol specifically, right? That main stress hormone in the brain. For those, for the viewers out there, what would you define cortisol as?
Yeah, cortisol is our main stress hormone. It's going to help us interact with our external environment. It's really important. It's really important to be able to have our internals be in a good spot there. And I think it's good to realize like what the nervous system is. We hear nervous system regulation all of the time, and there's so many different parts of it. You have your brain and your spinal cord, then you have the stuff that goes to your tissues. And one of those branches, it's the autonomic nervous system. So there's two parts. The first is the fight or flight system. And it's the one that I just brought up that tells us to be alert. It's really helpful. Then there's the rest and digest system, which is essentially the opposite. And people end up, somewhere on a sliding scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being, the parasympathetic. We're basically the Buddha, meditating all of the time, to 100, where we're in this fight or flight as if there's a tiger being chased after us. And cortisol's job is to help us with the sympathetic, that fight or flight response. And so when cortisol's released, it's mildly catabolic, meaning it's going to break the body down for energy via blood sugar. And it allows us to have all this energy to stay alert. And while it's doing that, it's also going to take away energy from other systems it doesn't think that we need to be using, like the digestive system.
So you're saying that cortisol's regular function should be to allow us to kind of tap into this energy source that's required and to survive, right? To fight or to fly if you need to. There can be issues if that's just done too much. What would you describe its functions as, cortisol in general? So we've talked about the fight or flight. Any other functions you'd say that it plays within the body?
Yeah, cortisol's main job is to give us energy to respond to these potential emergencies. If we're to think of like cars on a road, the normal cars that are driving down, right, those are our systems like digestion and reproduction and energy. And the cortisol response is like an emergency truck, like a fire truck coming down. And so when you're driving, if we have the fire truck coming by, right, starts honking, beeping, we hear the sirens, what do the rest of the cars do? They're going to pull over and move over. So cortisol, or those fire trucks, can get through. And so that's what happens, right? We're going along our day like normal. We now have this stress response and we have to move over for these fire trucks to pass. Well, the problem becomes if this stress response is constant, we constantly have fire trucks going by and the normal functions can't get down the road like normal.
That's a beautiful analogy. So what you're saying is cortisol's peaked. All the other functions, the organs in the body, are taking a back seat to what they're supposed to be doing normally. And you do this long enough, you're going to start seeing some of the effects of these things, of them kind of being in the back seat and just not driving the way that they're supposed to.
Exactly. Yeah, our body's primary response is to keep us alive. Right? If we think about evolution, caveman days, all we had to do was worry about staying alive. And now we have the luxury. We always have food in our fridge. We have access to food 24/7. We have jobs that allow us to have security in some ways. And so while we don't have immediate threats to our survival in most cases, we are still creating that same stress response. And so cortisol was meant to be evolutionarily helpful, right? Help us respond in an emergency. And what's happened now in this modern world is we're creating these emergencies through unconscious or conscious effort, as well as in our environment. So I know we'll get to that later, is, things in our environment that can actually impact our cortisol levels.
How does cortisol relate to how we're looking and just the general population and the environment?
Cortisol itself is going to protect us, right? Our body's primary response, again, always wants to keep us alive. And so when cortisol is dominant, it's going to shuttle energy away from other systems. And when it comes to how we look, you'll hear a lot of people talk about cortisol face and cortisol belly. Okay, you'll hear people talk about weight gain of the face and weight gain in the belly. And the primary reasons that we're seeing this is, again, evolutionarily. Our ancestors were in these modes where they had to fight for food or there was scarcity. And so cortisol, especially around the abdomen, it's used as an energy reserve. So it can be quickly tapped into if we need it. But also, most of our major organs, the things that are most important to us, are around our abdomen. Your body doesn't care about your arms that much or your legs that much. There aren't vital organs there, but our liver, our digestive system, our reproductive system, all around the abdomen. And so if our body thinks that we're in this high state of stress, then our body's going to protect those things in this survival mode. And that's why it's so hard for a lot of people to lose like those last 10 pounds or that last bit of belly fat. It usually is a manner of effort where, they're not dieting enough, they're not exercising enough. It usually comes down to this nervous system response.
The term visceral belly fat gets thrown around quite a lot. Would you be, are you alluding to this, that is this increase in visceral belly fat that people are seeing as a result of high cortisol?
It can be a result of high cortisol or low cortisol and the stress response. I think what happens over time, if we are having a high cortisol response, the adrenal glands, which are the glands that pump out cortisol, they actually aren't able to work as hard. Or it'd be like, thinking about running a marathon. If you start sprinting out the gate, those first couple miles, you're not going to have enough gas in the tank to make it those last few at the same effort. And that happens to your adrenal glands as well with cortisol. It'll pump it out high for quite some time. For some people, that looks like months or years. And over time, if we don't correct that response, then it actually starts to come down, even though they're still having symptoms. So when we think high stress, we usually think high cortisol, but it could be high or low cortisol.
Could you describe some symptoms someone would feel with high cortisol and symptoms someone would feel with low cortisol?
For sure. So sometimes there's some overlap and it's not always clear, which is why I recommend testing if somebody's unsure. But generally, if somebody has high cortisol, they're going to be in this hyperactive state. We tend to see higher blood sugar. We'll see maybe tendencies for anxiety. They'll still crash in the afternoons, but we'll see like racing hard or maybe this tired but wired feeling where somebody's like really tired at nighttime. They want to go to bed. They can't shut their brains off. That happens a lot. With the low cortisol response, we might see more this chronic fatigue type syndrome where we have lower blood sugar, we've ran out of gas, we see inflammation, we see low libido, we see a lot more of the diagnoses come in with lower cortisol. And both of them, unfortunately, have weight gain as a byproduct. So if that's something that somebody's concerned about, we have to look at other symptoms or other sources of data to determine if it's high or low.
What tests do you recommend for someone to check? Like how do I go about finding out like where my cortisol levels are at?
Totally. If somebody is utilizing somebody in functional practice, I use the Dutch test personally. This is a really common hormone panel. It looks at cortisol throughout the day and also looks at sex hormones and other metabolites down the line. I love that test. It's really easy and it tends to test for other things alongside of cortisol, but you can isolate it to saliva if you're walking into like a naturopath's office as well.
Okay, so now we know how to check our cortisol, but if you could explain to us this pathway of this elevated level of cortisol and someone having this belly fat, like how does this happen?
Yeah, so it is this progression. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Along the x-axis here, this bottom portion, we see the progression of chronic stress. And up here, we're going to see on the y-axis this cortisol sum. And so this is going to be all four measures of the test altogether. And so when we put that here, we're going to be somewhere on this graph. And typically, if we're to think of our bodies as operating like a car, and let's say we're driving on the freeway, I'm located in the States, so we use miles per hour. Okay, the typical speed limits, right? We don't want to be going at 0, don't want to be going at 100 miles an hour. We want to be coasting somewhere, 55, 60 miles an hour. And what should happen is if things are going on the road and we come up a little bit, right? So maybe somebody comes and rides our tail, we can speed up and then slow back down. Okay, this is the ability in green to have homeostasis, the ability to down-regulate. This is where we want to be. Well, let's say that car doesn't go away. It kind of stays on our tail. We got to hit the gas a little bit more. Now we're coming up here in this yellow version, this acute distress. And this is where we're going at like 75, maybe 80, 90 miles an hour. And while we might feel good here, we may start to wear out the life of the car, right? We're going to worsen the tires a bit, shorten the life of the engine, and start to run out of gas. And so that's what happens when people start to utilize this cortisol a little bit too much. They end up in this orange phase. It's actually called a compensatory phase. And this is where somebody can actually test normal, but they still have symptoms because cortisol is on its way down. And if we continue, that car stays on our tail, maybe it starts to rain, or really just emphasizing the life of this car here, we come down, we aren't able to keep up with the speed limits anymore. We're going at like 45 miles an hour if we're lucky. And this is actually where I find a lot of people is in this red exhaustion phase, right? And so a lot of people, when they think high stress, they think high cortisol, but it really could be a low cortisol situation.
Okay. And let's say they've now had this chronic stress. You've now tested. How is that causing this belly fat?
Yeah, great question. So in that form of stress, right, the only thing our bodies care about is keeping us alive. And so what it wants to do is protect these visceral organs or protect the most important parts of us, protect the stomach, the liver, the things we can't replace or can't live without. And so that's where this belly fat starts to show up, is while we're running out of gas, while we're trying to fight whatever the perceived threat is, whether it's work or kids or something in our heads, the body is in a perceived survival mode. It doesn't know that we're here in 2024 and everything's taken care of. What it does know is evolutionary patterns of, hey, I need to protect myself. There might not be food when I get up tomorrow. There might not be enough energy for me because I've been expending so much energy trying to stay alive that I need to store some in case there's an emergency and that this lasts a long time, like another ice age.
We spoke a bit about environment. We know we are living in this toxic food environment now. There's like more McDonald's around you than a normal grocery store with whole food. Would you say that there's this correlation between this high cortisol and us trying to find these comforting ways to kind of deal with it by eating a little bit more, eating out more? Do you see this relation with high cortisol and how our environment's actually even making it worse?
Absolutely. I think convenience is really the quote unquote enemy here. The convenience of having food that isn't nutritious for us, that's going to actually be inflammatory. And cortisol's job is to be an anti-inflammatory. So if we're constantly introducing inflammation into the system with processed foods and oils and sugars, then the body's going to need to fight that. What also happens with these higher sugar type foods is the blood sugar response spikes up very fast, but then it comes down really fast. And the body starts to become afraid that response is too quick, comes up and down too fast. So cortisol actually steps in to keep the blood sugar response normal. And that's where we see this relationship with cortisol and having these, junk food everywhere. Like you said, there's McDonald's before there's going to be a Whole Foods, especially in, lower socioeconomic status type cities. Another beautiful thing about our world is technology, but we actually don't understand the mechanisms enough just yet of what some of these frequencies could be doing to the body. And they do cause inflammation. There is some studies out there that showing, frequencies, Wi-Fi, EMFs, those are things to pay attention to. But I think the average person could be looking at just their exposure to blue light and being on screens all the time, because blue light actually stimulates cortisol production. It acts as sunlight, right? Our bodies don't realize, hey, it's a computer screen, it's not the sun, so I need to be awake, just like I am during the day. Yeah.
Is there a format or a way that you go about things in terms of being able to lose belly fat and bringing your cortisol down and just fixing all these issues that you could be dealing with due to this high cortisol?
Yeah, absolutely. There are 5 main lifestyle practices that I like to bring in to help regulate cortisol. And the first has to do with nutrition, which we've talked a little bit about, and it's about managing our blood sugar. One of my favorite phrases is no naked carbs. The reason being is I just talked about carbs are going to spike our blood sugar. Now we need carbohydrates. They are not the enemy. You absolutely should eat them. But if we eat them in isolation, it can give us this big spike and then this big drop that brings on the cortisol response. So my rule of thumb is always pair your carbs with a protein source or a fat source to keep blood sugar a little bit more stable, and therefore cortisol is a little bit more stable.
Incredible. And I always get people asking me, is there benefit to eating it in an order?
There definitely is. So when we eat in an order that considers our blood sugar, if you were to look at a plate, you want to consume your fiber first. That's going to slow digestion. It's going to allow your body to, again, blunt this response a little bit. And if we're talking fibers, typically veggies. I get the question of, do fruits count? It depends on the fruit and how much fiber is in there, but typically we're going to eat our veggies first. Then we want to eat our protein and our fat sources next because they raise our blood sugar, but not quite as much as carbohydrates do. Then you can move on to your carbohydrates and eat those last. That is going to be the most beneficial for keeping blood sugar stable. Now, let's say you get a big bowl and everything's mixed in all together. Not a huge deal if you eat that on occasion. But if you're somebody who's struggling with weight management or struggling with a stress response, it really does behoove you to eat in this order: fiber first, protein and fats next, and then carbohydrates last.
Incredible. And I love that naked carb analogy. When you say that, the way I think about it is like someone naked. So if you're just like having it, it's bad for you. But when you talk about stuff like fiber, it just gives me this idea of like a coat that you're putting over the carb that can just think of it. And if you've done the biochemistry, like fiber can sometimes be pictured as this mesh, right? So I'll think of it as like this coat that you can put over yourself. And just if you're just having, let's say you just have a croissant on its own, it's naked and it's going to spike your blood sugar really quickly, right? This bolus. When you chew the croissant, it's just this mush. But if you've now added, let's say you've decided to have a salad before the croissant, you add this coat around it, right? And it's no more naked. And that will slow the release of sugar into the blood. This will improve your overall sugar levels. I know I had my CGM, a continuous glucose monitor on.
Yeah.
I saw it myself.
But yes, the second one is to limit caffeine intake. If we a typical morning that somebody has, they're going to get up, their alarm's blaring, they're going to look at their phone, then they're going to grab a coffee and then have some sort of, high sugary breakfast, the cereals, the croissants, the sandwiches, the smoothies, the oatmeal. And what we've done there, if we remember how cortisol interacts in our body, it's already at its highest in the morning. And so what we're doing is we're just pushing on this gas pedal. And so if cortisol's already high, we're going to push on that gas pedal with caffeine. We're going to push on that gas pedal with more sugary carbs. We're going to push on that gas pedal with this light exposure. And so if we can start to bring those things down, including limiting caffeine, or if you're going to drink it, because I like it too, drink it after your breakfast, that's going to help this cortisol response.
With limiting caffeine, is there a number that you like giving people? What is like that safe zone?
Well, the reason we need more and more is because we've pushed on that gas pedal of cortisol so much that we're actually running out of the cortisol. And so in order to have the same response to get to that height of the graph before, we need more caffeine. So that's typically what's happening. So I do recommend for those that feel that way, that actually, bringing caffeine out altogether, while it doesn't feel good those first few days, we can start to restore our natural hormone rhythm. Now, when it comes to recommendations, there is a caveat that you have two types of people. Somebody could be a slow metabolizer of caffeine and all drugs, or they could be a fast metabolizer of caffeine and all drugs. For me, I'm the kind of person that's a slow metabolizer. I can have caffeine and it kind of makes me feel jittery. Or we have the fast metabolizer who can have an espresso before bed and they're fine. And so a general rule of thumb, I like to say 100 milligrams or less is helpful. It's usually a cup or so of coffee, maybe an espresso shot or two. But if you're somebody that realizes they're a little bit more sensitive, you might have to err on the side of lower than that. If you're somebody that's less sensitive, then you might be okay to be on the higher side of that. And for numbers, about 60% of the population is in that slow metabolizer group.
So for everyone, that 90 to 100 milligrams of caffeine is usually 1 cup. Okay, so caffeine limiting is number 2. And I think this is massive because I know I'm guilty, sitting here in front of you, of consuming more than 1 cup. And I would also say to the audience, those who are there's no way I'll function at this point. I think the big idea here is that we kind of want to reverse some of the effects of stepping on the gas for so long. So my advice as well would be, cold turkey might be very difficult. If you're at 3 cups, go to 2, then try and go to 1. And you'll find that your natural energy source will restore itself.
The one thing I'll say is, for those who feel that caffeine is a non-negotiable or that they might not be able to function without it, the first thing I'll say is that's a signal to you, right? That there's something that we can alter, that you were born perfect and your body has natural energy if we allow it to. And so that's data for us. And the second thing is that you have 2 choices. You have pain, the current pain of not having your caffeine, or you have future pain of continuing to step on this gas pedal and burn out your adrenals.
Absolutely. There's a quote that I was just thinking of, Doc, as you mentioned that. Yeah, the quote goes, you either have the pain of regret or you have the pain of discipline. The third one, what would you say is the third key or step here?
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to the stepping on the gas pedal. The third thing I would do is reduce your blue light exposure, especially at nighttime. And for somebody that's, what's blue light? You can simply think of it as screens, laptops, computers, TVs, phones. All wonderful things. We use them all day long, and it can be extremely helpful for the convenience of our world. But what blue light does is it actually stimulates your cortisol production. Your body doesn't realize that it's not the sunshine, and it just sees light. And the body's going to respond to that. If we think back to ancient times where farmers on our land and the sun is up, we have to have cortisol up to be able to work. As the sun starts to come down, the body's going to now switch its hormone signaling for us to get sleepy. We have a hormone called melatonin, which a lot of people have heard of. They'll usually take melatonin if they have issues sleeping. Well, cortisol and melatonin have a reciprocal relationship. What that means is when one is up, the other one is down. And so when cortisol is up, melatonin is down. When we want to be awake, cortisol is up, melatonin down. When we want to go to sleep, we want our natural melatonin to come up and cortisol to be down. But what happens if we're on these screens late at night, the phones, the TVs before bed, the extra work that we have to get done, then we're stimulating this cortisol production. And so there is a way to reduce this. People have started to wear what are called blue light blocking glasses, and that can be helpful. Now, a really clear something to make clear here is that blue light blockers have to be colored. They have to be these amber or orange lenses for them to actually filter out the blue light. Will it completely filter out everything? No, but it will reduce that cortisol response that so many people are getting before bedtime. And that's why they're having trouble sleeping, or their mind's racing. It takes them a while to wind down, or they don't get enough of that deep REM sleep that's so restorative that helps produce hormones.
Now, I know another thing is we now see, even when Apple has taken this into consideration, and they have this night mode where they'll kind of turn the hue of your screen. That's not enough, right? Or would you say that's enough?
Don't agree that it's enough. I think it's helpful. It's a little bit, but we're still getting some of that light. So I actually, at nighttime, I turn my phone to grayscale completely, just takes all the color out, and I'm wearing my blue light blockers. We also send them to all our clients as well. So I love that you do that.
Absolutely. But and what time do you recommend, Doc, to start wearing the blue light glasses? Is there like a format that you say, hey, this is the time I put them on?
Yeah, ideally about 2 hours before bedtime so that we can start to bring down cortisol production, bring up melatonin production. Now, if you're hustling that day and it's just like 30 minutes before bed, it's almost like the Pavlov's dog effect where we just start to associate the blue light blockers with sleep. And so I've had my clients, after they start to use them, while they just put them on, the body's like, okay, time for bed, right? It's like if you take a shower before bed, your body starts to understand that environmental cue.
What would you say, Doc, is the fourth thing, the fourth key?
Yeah, then we talk about moving into other lifestyle factors like movement, right? And movement primarily has to do with the regulation of blood sugar, but there's nuance here. You and I have both competed, and I want to ensure that people move enough, but not too much. And so we can err on the side, most people aren't moving enough. And the general recommendation that's been studied very well is about 7,000 steps per day. We start to see benefits for your metabolism. And so for somebody who is looking to lose weight, this is great to incorporate movement. But I'm not just talking about one longer walk that gets you to the 7,000. What's more important actually is moving every hour. I know the Apple Watch does this. It has a little beeper for every minute. If you haven't moved, it asks you to stand. And the data behind this is to allow your muscles to use up the glycogen that's sitting around, that blood sugar. And so what can be more beneficial than just taking walks is, I have some of my clients, they'll go and take 10 squats every hour, or they'll hit a couple push-ups, or they'll get up and walk around for a moment just to tell our muscles to get moving. And when we do that, we allow for more stable blood sugar levels, which we've already talked about allows for more stable cortisol levels. Now, the other end of this is there are some people, and I definitely fell into this boat, who over-exercise. Now, I willingly chose to over-exercise at the time. And what was that?
Especially competing.
Oh, absolutely. I don't want to name my protocols here because I don't want anybody to go do them. over exercising, underfeeding to get to a certain body fat percentage. And I tested my cortisol, and I tested it before I competed and after. And it absolutely brought my cortisol down a lot because we were in that chronic stress response for so long that my adrenal glands couldn't keep up with it anymore. You hear of a lot of competitors or athletes or even people who run marathons, especially women, they'll start to have these symptoms of like low libido, or they have irregular menstrual cycles, or men have issues with their libido, and it's just a part of prep. It's just a part of being an athlete. Well, the reason being is your body's in this hyper stress response of too much movement that it doesn't care about reproduction. That's the last thing it cares about if it thinks that you're constantly being chased by a tiger. And so it's finding this happy medium, and it's why hiring a coach like you guys is so helpful to understand, okay, what does biofeedback look like? What does our sleep look like? How is our weight responding? What are your hunger cues like? That's going to tell us information about your blood sugar, about your cortisol levels. Are we resting enough? Are we doing too much? Where's that sweet spot? Yep.
Fifth step. What's the fifth thing you want people doing?
The fifth step has nothing to do with diet or exercise. It has everything to do with regulating our stress management. And this could be through all sorts of practices. We hear a lot about mindfulness. And the reason this is so important, and there's many avenues for it, you can meditate, you can practice mindfulness, you can journal, you can do breath work, you can practice gratitude. What we're doing in these states is that we are allowing the cortisol response to slow down. We have two primary branches of the autonomic nervous system: the parasympathetic, rest and digest, and we have the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. And if we think of it 0 to 100, okay, most people, if 0 is the Buddha, we're parasympathetic, to 100, we're being chased by a tiger, we're sympathetic. Most people are averaging out like 70 to 80, and that's really generous. And so if we're constantly there, we're constantly pumping out this fight or flight stress response. What these practices do is they allow us to move on that scale a little bit, right? You don't have to be at 0. And we don't want you to be at 100 either. We want you operating maybe in that 50 range. And so these practices do is allow you to move down maybe a couple points. All right, bring some presence into our lives. I always start my client calls with breath work. I know you've had exposure to that, to just like allow us to sit for a moment and realize like everything right now here is taken care of. There is nothing you need to do, because in our brains, we make up 90% of the things that we're thinking, either out of past concerns, and we think about fear or depression, or future worry, and we think about anxiety. And all of these things are not real in this present moment. And so we can then tell our body like, hey, we're good, you're safe, you don't need to be giving off that response. Let's say we get a bad email from somebody, or an email we perceive is going to harm us in some way, we're gonna lose our job. Well, the first things we might think of is, oh my gosh, somebody's gotten upset with me before. And we think into the past. Okay, we have that fear coming up. Or we think something's going to happen, and we start playing out all these future situations of anxiety. When in reality, this is just text on a screen, and nothing has changed other than you've received it. But everything mentally playing out, that's stimulating the cortisol, the stress response, because your body thinks it needs to be in survival mode. So that's part one of the stress response, and just being really mindful. Right? I love telling people to just, if they've never done mindfulness before, just start journaling, right? Maybe write out 3 things you're grateful for. This is my favorite practice because, one, when we handwrite, which nobody does anymore, I don't think they teach cursive in grade school. I think they stopped doing that actually, is that we're able to write slower than we can actually think. So it forces our body to slow down. Our handwriting can't keep up with us. And the second portion is, if we just do 3 things that we're grateful for, it's super nice, it's happy-go-lucky, but there's hormone data to this. Gratitude itself stimulates a hormone called oxytocin. This is the love hormone. We get it when we hug people, when we're connected with somebody. It also happens when we practice gratitude. And here's the really cool thing about oxytocin. Oxytocin brings cortisol down. And so one of the simplest things we can do, I do this every morning when I wake up. I open my eyes and I think of 3 things that I am grateful for. And then I move on with my day, automatically bringing down that cortisol response.
Because I'm with you, and you know what, this to me is something I haven't paid attention to, or I did in the past, right? So just to give people a background, I grew up in a very African household, right? My dad's Namibian, my mom's Cuban. It's just like high energy, traditional, like, and there was a point in my life where I was just like, I need a way to deal with all the stress from medical school. I know you went through this, doc, and just stress factors, right? And being like, I'm busy, I'm moving. And I was at a point where I just didn't have any more tricks in my book, right? Where like the training wasn't working anymore in terms of bringing stress levels down, which we know we do. And I gave up and I was like, I'm just going to try this meditation thing. And
Mhm.
it helped me. So I agree. I totally agree with you that all these practices utilize the same medium, even the same. Would you agree the same with yoga in terms of the advice I always give is we all love apps. The one
Mhm.
I use is Calm. The other one everyone speaks about is Headspace.
Yeah, I love the Headspace app. I love the Calm app. I think another one we forget is quite literally our life force, and it's our breath. And a practice that I'll give people, I'm very touch oriented. So I'll say, put your hands on your chest. And immediately what this does is it takes us out of our head, puts us into our bodies, right? It reminds us that we're not these situations that we're maybe thinking about or the to-do lists, because 75% of people are operating in these states of consciousness of like fear and anxiety and worry and survival mode, right? And so if we can just remember for a moment, you can close your eyes, put your hands on your chest, and just inhale in, hold your breath, and then exhale out the mouth even slower. And do that 10 times. And when I say that to some people, it feels uncomfortable at first. And so you can go 6 count in, 7 count hold, 8 count out, 10 times. It realistically only takes a little over a minute or so, right? And that alone, going 10 rounds, brings us back into the presence of the body.
And if you're at this point, this stuff is all resonating with you. This is important. You just need to go and put all the things we just mentioned into practice. Dr. Sierra, you're incredible. We at Sculpt by Science feel incredibly lucky to be able to work with you. Everything she mentions, I will have in the link in the description of this video. Where can people find you?
Absolutely. So first and last name is where you'll find me on all platforms. Dr. DR, first name, last name, YouTube, Instagram, and we have a website as well. The website is just my name. It's a link it below. Feel free to message me with any questions directly on Instagram as well. It's how Dr. Mike and I connected. And so I'm happy to support any of you as well.
Dr. Sierra, I want to give you a big thank you for taking the time out of your day to speak with me and my audience. And I'll leave it there. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.